Let's talk about Oliver Twist. I already read this one on the channel, but I recently reread it. Took me a while, but I finally got there, and my thoughts on the book changed quite a lot. I did enjoy it a lot the first time, but I did find there were some things that held the book back, and I've reflected on it a little bit, and my views have changed a little bit, so there's enough to get some new meat out of the discussion and go into a little bit more depth, so that's what we're going to do today. Oliver Twist is a very odd novel, because on the one hand it's one of Dickens' most well-regarded, at least in popular culture. Probably it's his second best known after A Christmas Carol, and yet as a book it's often regarded as one of his lesser works. And a lot of that comes down to issues with Oliver the character, and also the plot, which is sometimes contrived, and just things in general not gelling together in the perfect way. That said, despite its many faults, I do think it has some great character work, some great themes, and so those are the things that I'm going to be exploring in today's video. Part 1. Oliver, the Forgotten Child. Dickens is often accused of creating very one-dimensional characters, especially when those characters are either women or children. Typically, it's the helplessness of these characters that people dislike, and the idea that because they don't have agency, they're just worthless characters. Now personally, I think that has to do more with our obsession with agency in characters than it does necessarily with the characters themselves. So is it really fair to just criticise Oliver because he's such a helpless, powerless character? And what's wrong with having powerless characters in novels? When I first read Oliver, I was in that same camp. As far as I was concerned, he just wasn't a very interesting character. In fact, it seemed at times that Dickens himself didn't really care all that much about Oliver. At the start of the novel though, things are pretty good. We're able to empathise with Oliver as he's in this terrible situation at the workhouse. We feel for him when he's beaten and abused simply for asking more, and even more so when he then leaves the workhouse and works for Mr. Sowerberry, the undertaker. He gets abused by an apprentice called Noah Claypole, and Oliver at this point has one moment of passion. He stands up for himself after Noah abuses his dead mother. And this is one of the great scenes of the story, and is probably Oliver's finest moment. He stands up to Noah, beats him up, quite justifiably, but then of course, because this is the way the world works, Oliver is the one who is beaten, abused, and locked away for doing this. Now what really marks this moment in the story is, like I said, it's Oliver's standout moment. We see a different side to his character here, a kind of fire and passion that comes out when he's faced with injustice. Whereas for the rest of the novel, he's pretty much just a very placid victim. And it's a shame because Dickens really could have used this aspect of Oliver's character. Oliver finds himself in the clutches of a gang of thieves, and given that Oliver has this sense of injustice and this violent side, maybe it would have been more interesting for Dickens to have explored that. Not to say that Oliver should have ultimately turned into a bad un, but maybe it would have been better if he'd have just got into that a little bit more, into the complexity that Oliver might have gone through. Unfortunately, Oliver's character development peaks at that moment. We never see this side to him again in the story, which is a real shame. As soon as Oliver falls into the clutches of Fagin and his gang, he is just a victim going from pillar to post with no real control over his environment, no real agency to speak of, and when it comes to the latter part of the story, pretty much the entire third act, Oliver is almost absent entirely. In fact, the only reason he gets saved is due to the actions of the other characters, like Nancy and Mr. Brownlow and everyone else. Now, despite having this criticism, I think there is a good reason for Dickens in doing this. It seems to me that Dickens really wants to convey the powerlessness of children in this particular society. And maybe that was the only way for Dickens to tell the story. To really show how powerless Oliver was, he needs to sort of become a secondary character in his own narrative. He needs to not have agency, precisely because children didn't really have that much agency at the time. It's only a matter of luck that Oliver manages to come through the other side. In one of the sadder parts of the story, right at the end when Oliver is finally liberated and back with Mr. Brownlow, he goes back to the workhouse to find an old friend, a young boy called Dick, who we only meet at the beginning of the story. He's a very sickly child, and it doesn't seem like he's going to live long in this world, and to Oliver's shock, he finds that Dick has died during this whole escapade. Although Dick is barely in the story at all, I think this is a very important moment, especially considering this theme of powerlessness. This happens right after Oliver attains his own liberty, and it reminds the reader right away that this could have been Oliver. Oliver could have been Dick. He could have just died in the workhouse, if not for luck, if not for these other characters working on his side. And so by contrasting the two in this way, at the very end of the novel, it really brings that theme out and just shows how powerless children are in this society. So does it matter then that Oliver doesn't have agency given these considerations? Well, I don't think it matters all that much. By making Oliver powerless in this way, Dickens is able to show the powerlessness of children in the system, especially with that comparison with Dick. At the same time though, it does mean that Oliver Twist is not a very interesting character, and you do have to wonder, did Dickens really have to go so far in order to show the powerlessness of Oliver? This is especially true in that last part of the book, where Oliver really isn't present at all. You know, it would have been more interesting to have Oliver involved in some way in some of the events of the latter part of the book. And in fact, in many adaptations of the novel, Oliver is involved in things like the murder of Nancy and the aftermath with Bill and with Fagin's arrest. And so it makes more sense because the book is about his character and it brings him into the story. Whereas the way it goes, it really does seem like Dickens almost did lose interest in the character of Oliver Twist and just wanted to focus on those other characters. And it also seems like he could have conveyed that message of powerlessness without necessarily just excluding Oliver altogether from the story. We had that moment where Oliver shone, where he had that moment of anger, and it would have been interesting for Dickens to just have explored that, even just a little bit, to make him a more dynamic character. Part 2. Where did monks come from, and other contrivances? Oliver's last name, Twist, is a very good name for him and for this novel, because this novel is full of unexpected twists and turns. Some of them, unfortunately though, do stretch the realm of believability. Now, Dickens' early novels, like The Pickwick Papers and Nicholas Nickleby, are what you might call pastoral or episodic novels. Especially The Pickwick Papers, we basically just have a cast of characters who go from one ridiculous situation to another, and there's not really a through storyline, even though characters recur. Now, Oliver Twist sits in between Nickleby and Pickwick, and it kind of has a bit of that episodic picaresque feel, but at the same time it seems to want to be a more developed narrative, and because it doesn't do either of these things exactly, I think the novel does suffer a bit for it. At first, the novel feels very episodic. It feels like what Dickens is doing is just putting Oliver in these different situations to expose the dangers and tribulations of labour for children and also the criminal underworld. We get Oliver in the workhouse being abused. We get Oliver as an apprentice being abused. Then we get Oliver running away, becoming an urchin and being abused. And then we get him with Fagin and everyone else being abused. And it pretty much feels, like I say, like little episodes, basically with Oliver just going from pillar to post, being battered. But then, in the second part of the novel, Dickens moves away from that more episodic feel and starts to create a more systematic story. This particularly with the introduction of the character of Monks. It turns out that Oliver has an older half-brother by the same father called Monks, and Monks is pretty much the major villain of the story. By coincidence, Monks also happens to know who Fagin is, and he also wants to squander or get rid of Oliver's inheritance, because Oliver, if his parentage is known, actually stands to inherit a little bit of money. Monks then falls in with Mr. and Mrs. Bumble, and there's lots of contrivances there as well, and there's also an even more ridiculous contrivance, which is that Oliver, after a botched robbery, gets wounded, and he gets found by this family, and a member of that group, the people who live there, is a girl called Rose Maylie, who later on turns out to be Oliver's long-lost aunt, which is just insane in terms of contrivance. Now, the logic of Dickens' plot does fit together very nicely. I find this is always the case with most Dickens novels. There's just a way in which everything sort of comes together and fits together that feels nice. But while it might feel nice and fit together nice, it also does involve several leaps in the imagination. Now, these plot contrivances work perfectly fine in a more episodic, picaresque novel, because they're episodic, they're sort of meant to be slightly ridiculous and sort of funny and charismatic, so you don't really feel that bothered when you get these ridiculous characters returning in very bizarre ways. But with a more systematic novel, where it's meant to be a bit more realist, you want to avoid that where you can, and I think in this novel, Dickens overdoes it. It does make some great twists and turns, it does make for some shocking moments, but ultimately I do think it damages the quality of the novel a little bit because it just makes it harder to believe. Part 3. The Criminal Underworld. So Dickens isn't only interested in exploring how terrible it is for children to be in workhouses or have these apprenticeships, he also wants to focus on the horrors of crime and the ways that children are pushed into crime by grooming adults. And it's here that we get the character of Fagin, this Jewish character who manipulates children into becoming a part of his band of thieves, ultimately doing his dirty work for him. And Fagin is pretty happy to get rid of these children and any people who work for him if it's convenient for him. An interesting thing about Fagin is that he's also portrayed in a very different way in film adaptations. It's rare that people play him fully as the kind of reprehensible evil being that he is in Oliver Twist. He does have a bit of charm in the novel, but it's a very thin veneer of charm and you can see the evil underneath all of it. Whereas in something like the musical, he's sort of not really all that evil. He's kind of funny and silly, and if I remember rightly, he even gets away at the end as well and has the final moment with the Artful Dodger. So it's a very different portrayal there. Now there is some good reason for this. In fact, the portrayal of Fagin was, even in its own time, criticised as being anti-Semitic. Dickens refers to Fagin as the Jew to a ridiculous degree. I think in the early novels he actually used the name Fagin, barely at all. But then when as this was serialised, when it came to the latter part of the book, he ended up omitting lots of the references to Fagin being a Jew, and to further his need to make up for what he thought was not something that he intended. In later books he also created some very sympathetic Jewish characters. In his book, Our Mutual Friend, Dickens creates the character of Mr. Rhea, who is pretty much the anti-Fagin. Rather than taking poor people and corrupting them, Mr. Rhea takes poor women and gives them jobs in Jewish-owned factories. Anti-Semitism aside, Fagin is still a reprehensible character. Though he does have very superficial charm, it's pretty clear that he is quite ruthless and perfectly happy to let others die if it will keep him safe. And it is Fagin's ruthlessness that ultimately leads to Nancy's death, when he refrains from telling Bill Sikes that although Nancy has helped Oliver, she hasn't actually betrayed them, and this leads Bill to think that she has betrayed them, and so he kills her. Fagin's ultimate crime in the novel is his vindictiveness and his lack of trust, even towards people who trust him, despite the fact that he has no right to deserve it. When he learns about Nancy's secret plotting, he completely disregards the fact that she doesn't actually dob him in. He doesn't care about this because he doesn't trust her, because he's got a criminal mind. And the problem with a criminal mind is that it is by nature not very trusting, because you're doing things that are constantly breaking promises, breaking trust. And this is the problem. This is why Fagin doesn't believe that Nancy isn't going to turn them in. And also because he's just very vindictive and wants his revenge. The final chapter of Oliver Twist is one of my favourites. We find Dickens waiting execution in his cell, and he has completely lost the plot as he's contemplating his crimes, he's contemplating the scaffold being put up, the men he's seen on the scaffold, the men he's basically had put on the scaffold by backstabbing them, and thinking about his own impending fate. Then Oliver arrives, and Fagin thinks that he's going to get one last chance to escape. Oliver, on the other hand, merely blesses Fagin, but Fagin is so corrupt and far gone that he thinks that Oliver is trying to create a distraction. Of course he isn't, and Fagin is left there to die. Like I say, this is one of my favourite chapters in the novel. It's incredibly dark, the atmosphere is thick with the tension of what's to come for Fagin. It's one of the best bits of the novel, and even if you don't like Oliver Twist, I think you probably would like this chapter, and you could just read it on your own as a short story about a man who's done terrible things awaiting execution in his cell. It's a really affecting scene. That said, it doesn't really redeem Fagin all that much. As I say, ultimately he's still trying to get out at the very last moment. So again, a very different portrayal from what we get in a lot of the adaptations, where he's sort of portrayed in a more friendly, grandfatherly way. There is a little bit more complexity in some of the other people in Fagin's troupe. There's the unfortunately named Master Bates, who has a moral epiphany at the end of the story. When he learns that Nancy has been killed by Bill, he ultimately reforms and becomes a great person. And we also have the Artful Dodger, who is somewhat protective of Oliver. Now, usually these two characters, probably to avoid the embarrassing name of Mr. Bates, these two are usually fused together. Whereas actually in the book, the Artful Dodger vanishes about 2/3 of the way through the book. He gets caught with a snuff box and he gets taken away and deported or sent away to a penal camp in Australia. This is an interesting detail with the Artful Dodger because he is known as a fantastic thief. He's very charismatic and very charming, and yet he's caught stealing a snuff box. Basic, easy stealing. And I think with this moment, again, it shows just how powerless these kids are. Even though the Artful Dodger is great at what he does, he's ultimately caught very easily. So maybe even he's not as good as he thinks he is. or at the very least he's just as powerless as the rest of them. And it doesn't matter that he's Fagin's favourite thief, he still just gets discarded along with anyone else who gets caught by the police, because Fagin ultimately wants to protect himself. Part 4. Nancy and Bill. To me, the two characters that really make Oliver Twist a great novel for me are Nancy and Bill and the relationship between them. Now, Bill Sikes is an interesting character because at first he just comes across as a bullish, horrible tyrant, and to be fair, he is, even at the end of the story, all of those things, but he comes across as very one-dimensional, and it's only really when he gets manipulated by Fagin into killing Nancy, and then the aftermath of his killing Nancy, that we start to see another side of Bill. We start to realise that, you know, he probably at once was also someone who was manipulated into this, and he's just so far gone that he can't get out. But he does have moments of guilt, or seems to have moments of guilt. And in his death scene, this is most apparent when he is standing on a roof, making a rope so that he can swing off the roof to save himself from a mob that are coming from him. And he sees a vision of Nancy, presumably guilt rather than ghost, and this causes him to slip, and he hangs himself. Again, a bit of an example of the far-fetched nature of Dickens' plot here. Seems a bit ridiculous that that would happen, but it works. There's a kind of poetic justice to Sikes' end, and it just gives him a bit more complexity than he otherwise would have had. One thing that people say of Dickens is that he only writes two kinds of women, and we have the pure virtuous souls who are too good for this world, and grotesque harridans who bully men and beat children. And he certainly has these two styles of woman, but just like I think that the obsession with agency damages criticism, I also think this lens through which we view Dickens' female characters damages our ability to appreciate them. And this is definitely true when it comes to a character like Nancy, who, although she has her moments where she's berating men, she's justified in doing so, and she's not by any means a harridan, and although she is virtuous in some ways, she also isn't. So she is actually quite morally complex. So I don't really like it when people throw that at Dickens as a kind of lazy critique. Nancy is a very morally conflicted character, and if Oliver had been maybe a more interesting character, he could have turned into a Nancy kind of person. We find out that Nancy fell in with Fagin as well when she was younger, and she's lived this life for such a long time. When we meet her though, she is pretty much just like all the other thieves. She revels in her crimes, and in fact, when Oliver gets his first break from the thieves and lives with Mr. Brownlow for a bit, it's Nancy who is the one who pulls him back and takes him back to Fagin. Obviously, she then feels bad about this and she starts to have a bit more of a moral compass as the novel goes by, but she's always conflicted between these two worlds. On the one hand, she wants to escape. On the other hand, though, these criminals have actually been there for her, and they might not be the best people, they might not be the greatest people, but what has society ever done for Nancy? What good people have ever helped her along, given her a break? And it is interesting, it creates this sort of Stockholm syndrome almost with these characters, these children, because to some extent they can recognise that people like Fagin are exploiting them on the one hand, but they are also giving them a bed. They're also giving them skills, maybe not very good skills, but skills by which they can get a life for themselves, as disreputable as that life may be. Perhaps the most moving moment of Nancy's story comes when she meets Mr. Brownlow and Rose Maylie to help them discuss plans to help Oliver. And in this scene, Brownlow and Rose urge Nancy to also escape. They promise her that they'll be able to take her away, and they also ask if she will turn in her friends, in particular Fagin. And here's what Nancy has to say, proving that there really is honour among at least some thieves. "Bad life as he has led, I have led a bad life too. There are many of us who have kept the same courses together, and I'll not turn upon them, who might, any of them, have turned upon me, but didn't, bad as they are." Nancy places her trust in Fagin and in Bill, despite knowing their cruelty and their corrupt natures, because they've been there for her and they've never turned her in before. And she trusts that by doing this she can do one good thing, which is get rid of Oliver and give him a good life, but not do so at the cost of destroying her friends who have been there for her, despite the fact that she knows that they're bad, despite the fact that she knows that they abuse her, that Bill beats her. She's willing to stay with them because she recognises that she's part of this broken unit of people. Unfortunately, this has, as Dickens puts it in the chapter where Nancy dies, fatal consequences. Bill, corrupted by Fagin, comes home and kills Nancy. Another criticism that I found of Oliver Twist is that Dickens has a very simplistic critique of criminals. And again, I don't find that to be the case. Yes, he's pretty hard with characters like Fagin and monks who don't have much about them, but through Nancy and Bill, he portrays a little bit more complexity, especially with Nancy. So again, I just don't think that criticism quite holds. Yes, there are these out-and-out villains, but there are of course the pure virtuous souls, but there are also people in the middle. Part 5, Conclusion. So despite these good things that I have to say about Oliver Twist, I do still think that it is a flawed novel. Its structure is stuck between this episodic style that Dickens was going with for the most part in his early works, and trying to go for a more systemic narrative. There are too many plot contrivances and coincidences, and the main character is absent for most of his own story. But despite these structural flaws, there are some great moments, great characters, and some really great prose. The last chapter with Fagin is probably some of Dickens' best work. Also the chapters with Nancy and the whole run-up really from when she decides to start helping Oliver till Bill Sikes' death, I think is a great piece of storytelling. And of course Dickens does a great job of just doing his typical thing, of giving you that Victorian London, the dark seedy place where children are abused and exploited, the criminals, the charming but terrible characters like Fagin, all of that is there. It's also worth reading if you've only really known Oliver through the adaptations, because the adaptations do often change the book quite radically, and I think, to be honest, quite rightly, because some of the issues with the plot just wouldn't work on a film. You know, you couldn't really have a film Oliver Twist where Oliver Twist literally vanishes for basically the whole third act of the film. So I do think it's worth going back and reading it if you haven't and you're familiar with the films, just so you can get a sense of how different the original text actually is. So what do you think of Oliver Twist? What's your favourite Dickens novel, and what do you think about the things that I said about this book? I look forward to discussing this with you down in the comments. Take care everyone. Ta-ra.